Everyone, welcome. I'm going to give you a minute to log in from the waiting room. And we're going to try out two versions of closed captions today, so that's exciting. My usual little system, and then our speaker today has closed captions on his PowerPoint, so you can kind of compare and contrast. See which one is doing a better job and let me know. All right, the closed caption should be up on my end. All right, well, welcome. I'm glad to see so much excitement about the webinar today. I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services, and I'm so happy to have with us today John Tucker. He's going to be teaching us about medical terminology for legal professionals. John is the principal of Tucker Law Group, a law firm with a national VA service-connected compensation, disability insurance, and ERISA disability benefits law practice, and it's headquartered in St. Petersburg. And believe it or not, John has been practicing in disability law for 30 years. So I'm so happy to have him with us today. I know medical terminology is something I have struggled with in my disability cases and tried to teach myself about it, not being a medically inclined person at all. But my favorite thing was when I first started reviewing veterans records and I saw SOB and I thought, oh my goodness, they are insulting this veteran. And then I realized that meant shortness of breath. So John is going to enlighten us about how to get through these records accurately and effectively. So welcome, John. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Christy. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Looks good.
All right. So today, I'm not going to cover the entire world of medical terminology in 2 hours. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, but we're going to do everything we can to give you some tools and some tricks to tap into what you already know and to combine words that you've used before with new words to understand how words are put together. And in the process, we're going to cover in this PowerPoint presentation, you'll see my guess is somewhere around 100 or 150 words. Some of which I will not be directly explaining to you, others will be doing a dive into, but we've also got an extensive outline, about 35 pages that I believe Christy sent out shortly, just a little while ago. And it's intended not to be something that I'm going to read to you here today. You can go and look at it later. There are expanded segments of some of the things that I'm going to talk about. For instance, medical abbreviations. I'm not going to go through page upon page of medical abbreviations, but I have a significant list of medical abbreviations in that outline. And so we'll talk about some of those as we go. But let's start by, if I can get my page going, looking at a little quote from Bill Gates. The human body is the most complex system ever created. The more we learn about it, the more appreciation we have about what a rich system it is. And Christy mentioned that I have been doing this for 30 years. Actually, the very first case that was ever referred to me was a disability insurance case. And I was a matter of months out of law school at the time, or having been admitted at the bar, I should say. I was one of those attorneys that started college wanting to go to medical school. And then calculus and chemistry did me in, like many of my friends who became lawyers. And I had the benefit, I guess, of getting into the field of disability. Now, the first firm I worked for also did personal injury. So from the very beginning of my career, I've been a plaintiff lawyer the entire time. I've never worked on the defense side. I've never worked for the government, but I have always worked with anatomy, with injuries, diseases, and the things that impact a person's ability to function, whether that's in the context of a car accident or for a much, much larger portion of my practice, disability insurance or Social Security disability or veteran service connected compensation. So that's the background that I bring to you. One of the things that I think is wonderful about what we do is that it's just fascinating. The thing is, though, it's our chosen profession. You know, whether you're a legal assistant in a law firm, whether you're a law clerk, interested in this area, whether you're a young attorney getting into this area, whether it's injury, some type of assistance provided to developmentally disabled people doing disability work like I do, it's the chosen field of endeavor that you've engaged in. But more importantly, the people that we represent depend on you. Now, in some instances, somebody may be on this presentation and they may be representing an insurance company and somebody else is depending on them. I don't come at it from that perspective. I've never represented the insurance company, so I will tell you in the course of our 2 hours here, I'm not going to come at you with the view of tearing apart medical records or challenging what people do. Our purpose here today is really about understanding medical records. And I think whether you're on a plaintiff, defense, government side, it doesn't matter. Something like this can benefit you. At the end of the day, though, my perspective is what you see at the bottom of this slide. You have to know the material at least as well or better than the decision maker in the claim that you're handling. So that might be an adjuster. It might be a Social Security person, a governmental person, not an administrative law judge. It might be an administrative law judge. It might be the Department of Veterans Affairs. It may be a judge sitting in circuit court when you're making an argument, or federal court when you're making an argument, like in an ERISA disability case. So the challenge for us as practitioners is that we have to be able to understand this material at least at a working level. Now, the good thing is, it is one of the joys of what we do. It's fantastic. But if you were like me, you come out of law school and you don't know anything about this stuff. And one of the people that you also have to know it as well as is your boss. And I'd like to tell you a little story that really taught me a lesson very early in the first weeks of my practice of law. I had to research a situation where an individual had been in a car accident. They had a typical whiplash injury where their head was pushed forward and back at a fairly high rate of speed. And the doctor had indicated in the records that there was some muscular injury. Well, I wrote a memo on the topic to my boss and described the elevator scapulae muscle, which if you look at the diagram you see on your screen, that's what's highlighted in green. It's these muscles on the side of the neck. Now, they're not the only muscles on the side of the neck, but I came to find out that it's not the elevator scapulae, it's the levator scapulae. So how to stick your foot in your mouth easily when you're a young lawyer, you don't use the right words. It's also a way to demonstrate that you don't have a grasp of what you're looking at. And I don't offer this as a starting point to scare anybody. What I want everybody to understand is it's completely human not to understand this stuff if you haven't studied it. Now, you may have taken an anatomy and physiology course and you may have said, oh my God, John, you didn't know it was the levator scapulae. Most people are going to say, what in God's green earth is the levator scapulae? Well, it happens to be a structure in the neck, as on this diagram. You can see it's on the side. There's a whole bunch of other structures around it. And you may look at this and say, I don't know what any of those things are. So you've got the C1, C2, C1 through 4 bones at the top, the C7, those are the elements of the spine, the vertebra. You see the T1 through T4, that's the thoracic spine. That's the spine essentially where your rib cage attaches. You've got other muscles. You see the clavicle, which is your collarbone on the front of your chest at the top. You see the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. And you may not have known that your shoulder blade, which you may only feel sticking out of your back, is as large as it is. Well, the levator scapulae is a significant muscle involved in this part of the body. Well, I didn't know that as a new lawyer, and I wrote up a memo and I just referred to the elevator scapulae being impacted. I didn't do any research at the time. Unfortunately, this was 1991. Google and the little rectangle of knowledge that we all hold in our hand now, they weren't around. You had to go do research at a library. It was completely different. But today, you'd have the ability to look at this material instantaneously and find out what this muscle does. Now, the levator scapulae, while we're talking about it, is one of several muscles that you'll see here in the neck. You'll see that large muscle on the side is the sternocleidomastoid. We'll talk about that in a moment. You see the splenius capitis, the trapezius, which many people know as these muscles at the top of our shoulders that attach to our neck. Sometimes when you get a bit stressed out, they get tight. That's what the massage person may work on. The scalenes are deeper inside the neck. But these are all different muscles that do different things. Now, in the course of what we do, you don't necessarily have to understand in an instant moment of recall what all of these things do, but you should understand that you have the ability to go find what they do. You may not be able to spell them as you talk to someone, but you can find out how to spell them, and you can find out what they do. Significantly, a lot of what we see in these words can be broken down into parts. And in the outline, I go into a little more detail about this, but much of what we have in medical terminology comes from Greek and Latin. So, for example, even though we call them sexually transmitted diseases today, the term venereal disease actually came from the Roman goddess of love, Venus. It was thought that you got these diseases when you were in love, for what I hope are obvious reasons to people. So we draw them in different ways from Greek and Latin. That, of course, is just a reference that came in context, if you would. Others, we actually take the specific root word that meant something to the Greeks or the Romans, or we take a prefix or a suffix. Now, I know from having two daughters, one in college, one in high school, that the word root isn't taught anymore, but the word stem is. So a root word is just a stem word. They mean the same thing. So if you're in your 20s and you have no idea when I said root, what that meant, think of the word stem if that's what was taught to you in school. Prefixes and suffixes, if you weren't taught that in school, prefixes are those little segments of words that are tacked onto the front end, and suffixes are those tacked onto the back end. They have meaning to them. So a base word is a root that can stand alone. On the screen, you'll see the example is legal. So legal as a word by itself means something to us in English. If we add the prefix para to the front of it, we have paralegal. It means something different than the base word. If we add the suffix ities, we get legalities, and we have a completely different word. Sometimes we can add prefixes and suffixes. For instance, to the word normal, we can add ab and ities at the end, ab at the front, and get abnormalities. Now, understanding what these component parts mean has value to us. But again, a lot of these are drawn from words that existed in Greek and Latin. I had the benefit back in the dark ages, in the late 70s, of actually learning in middle school Greek and Latin roots. I know from having two daughters, again, they don't teach that anymore. But there is an element of this that if you commit certain prefixes and suffixes and roots to rote memorization, it will make your job much easier. You will be able to understand a lot more with having to go look things up online all the time. So breaking down a word can literally be as simple as what you see on the screen. Hyperthyroidism is an overactive thyroid. So the root word is thyroid. That's the thyroid gland. Hyper means excessive or higher than normal. And ism is a condition of. So it's a condition of an excessively producing thyroid gland. They're not all quite that simple, but that is certainly an example of how you can take the pieces of the word and have an understanding of what it's talking about, even if you don't have access to Google at the moment. So in my graphic a little earlier, you saw the sternocleidomastoid. And I'm using this as an example because it's a fairly imposing word. It's something that the first time you hear it, you think, oh my Lord, I have no idea what that means. And it's hard to pronounce. It's not readily apparent what it means, but we can break it down very simply, actually. Sterno is a reference to the sternum, which is a muscle set. It's actually composed of three parts in your chest, at the top of your chest. The sternocleidomastoid muscle actually originates in the manubrium, which is the thickest part of the sternum, and the clavicle, which is the collarbones that run to each side of your body from the sternum. So that's the origination point, and it runs, Clido refers to the clavicle. So the first part of the word tells you where it starts, and the second part of the word tells you where it ends. It actually inserts at the mastoid process of the temporal bone of the skull. So up here, right behind your ear. Now, what does the sternocleidomastoid do? The name doesn't necessarily tell us that, but I can tell you that it involves rotation of your head to the opposite side, turning it the other way, if you would, and flexion, which is bending the head forward, down towards the chest. Extension being leaning it back, looking up to the sky. So this imposing word, if you understood with what sterno and cleido meant, or what the mastoid process was, you'd have an idea of where this was in the body, which is the first step, and generally what it attaches to. I should say, if you have questions, put them in to the chat feature, and Christy will ask them as we go. So feel free to pipe up, and I'll stop as we go. Now, here's a little more graphic depiction of what I was just talking about. I offer this slide for a couple of reasons. First, we're going to talk about the sternocleidomastoid a little more, but second, you can go online and in an instant get 100 images of all of these things. And you'll see that I've got image credits listed throughout this slide presentation. There are many orthopedic offices, in other words, orthopedic surgeons, neurologists, other types of medical doctors. There are educational institutions. There are entire institutions based on nothing but teaching anatomy and physiology. And they have many, many resources online. So all of these images are available online. And you'll even see that the big image on the right, it came from Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia may not be an authoritative source for purposes of citing in a brief. It may be, depending on the circumstances, but generally I would not say it's the first place you want to cite something, but it can be a fantastic place for you to go find good images that explain parts of anatomy. So I would encourage you to rely on it as well as other things you find online. So here are a little better illustration of what I was talking about before. You will see to the left of the slide, the clavicular notch and the manubrium of the sternum. You will see the second picture, which shows the rib cage, a little more outward view of the body. If you look at the skull in the middle, the green shaded area is the temporal bone. And the mastoid process is the base of that, which if you look at the image on the right, is where the sternocleidomastoid attaches. And if you go down to the bottom, you'll see where it attaches to the sternum and the clavicle. So break the word down. Roots, prefixes, suffixes. So that root is generally a guide to the portion of the body or the body system that is involved. So sternocleidomastoid, because it's describing a muscle, doesn't necessarily tell you the part of the body, the part of the body system that's involved, but it does tell you the part of the body as we identify. Now, root words, and I'm not going to go through all these. You don't have to worry about that. We're not going to bore you that way today, but we'll touch on a few of them. Root words are going to give you a guidepost, and you will be amazed at how many of these, if you look at this slide, you know. Now we have two slides that we're going to look at of root words, but just look at the first one, abdomino or abdomen. You probably know that refers to the abdomen or abdominal. So you already know some of this. You may know that audio refers to hearing. You may know that bio refers to life. You may know that carcin or carcino refers to cancer, as in carcinoma, or bronchi refers to bronchial or bronchi, breathing, the lungs. Cardio refers to the heart. So as you think about these things, if you're looking at a word that's got cardio in the middle of it, and it has a prefix on it, electrocardiogram, and a suffix, gram, you may realize, okay, that refers to the heart, electric, something about the electrical signals in the heart. Gram probably refers to measurement or testing, and it happens to be a test of the heart, of the electrical signals in the heart. To the right side of the screen, derm refers to skin, so dermatitis. And if you knew that itis meant inflammation, well, then you've got inflammation of the skin. Dermatology, OLOGY, means the study of. So dermatology is the study of the skin, and so on and so forth. So many of these you already know intrinsically just because of your vocabulary. You may have heard something before. So don't be frightened of learning these words. This is a challenge only in the sense that there's many things that go on in the body, and it does take an entire course in college to teach anatomy and physiology. But there's not so much that it's overwhelming to the point that you cannot learn it. You certainly can learn it. Some more root words. Intestine relates to the intestines. That could be obvious to you. I hope it is. Laparo may not be. That refers to the abdomen. But of course, we have laparoscopic surgery these days. Mal means bad, as in malignant. Neuro refers to nerves. So neurology is the study of nerves. Ophthalmo refers to eyes. So an ophthalmologist, and that is how you spell it, by the way, with the L before the M. Ophthalmologist is a doctor who treats the eyes. So on and so forth. So if you go through this list, which is contained also in the more detailed outline, commit these to memory. It will aid you a lot as you proceed with understanding medical terminology. Now, some basic prefixes. Most of these you should know cold. It's not a long list. A or an, lack of or without. Dis, meaning abnormal, difficult, or painful. So dysfunction, abnormal function. Poly, meaning many. Pseudo, meaning false or deceptive. And in medical terms, that's typically the way something appears. Retro, meaning behind or backward. So an example that may be memorable for retro, there are certain medications that men take for or to treat inflammation of the prostate. And very often they result in retrograde ejaculation, which is actually where their semen moves the opposite way back up their urethra as opposed to coming out the other end. So use little tricks for yourself as you think of words, see images to help you remind yourself of what these are. And then the suffixes on the right side, ectomy means surgically removing something. Itis, I said this before, inflammation. Lysis is breaking down, decomposition, or destruction. Ology is the study of something. Otomy is to cut into something. So that concept would be actually entering the body very often. Pathy, pathy is a disease or disease process. Plasty is a surgical repair. So you may have seen the word arthroplasty before, often used with something like a shoulder. Now, NRSNG actually has a really good YouTube channel. And if you're trying to learn some of these terms, what they do is help train nurses, nursing students. A tip from them that I always found pretty helpful was start at the back of the word and go forward, because the back of the word is very often going to tell you at a bigger level what it's about. So for example, if you see the back of a word is ectomy, that means to cut something out. You know you're talking about a surgery where they cut something out, like an appendectomy. And then you just have to figure out what appendec stands for. Of course, that stands for appendix. And otomy, cutting into, as I just said. So look at our first example here, hyperglycemia. That's high blood sugar. Anemia is a condition of the blood. Glyc is glucose. Hyper is excessive. So you know that is a condition of the blood sugar where it's excessive. So you could divine that from looking at that word. Hypo would be the opposite, too low. Cardiology, the study of the heart, as we talked about earlier. OLOGY, study of. Cardi means heart. So I would encourage you to utilize resources like NRSNG, and there are several others on YouTube where people give you different mnemonics and other things to help you remember what these terms mean, or think about how they get put together and give you ways to remember them. So next, we're going to turn into body systems. And again, I mentioned at the beginning, we're not just going to go through words and talk about what the words mean. I want to talk about these things in context some. And in this presentation, what you will typically see is the italicized words or medical terms. They're things that you may run across at different times. Now, if you do either Social Security disability or veterans disability work, you will definitely understand the concept of body systems, because each of those governmental organizations breaks up their assessment system into different body systems. Each uses 14. Now, in our presentation, we're going to talk about 13 because I've combined all the special senses into one. When you read about this online, you may see it range anywhere from 11 to 14. So don't get so hung up on the number, but you can know if you do SSI or Social Security disability insurance cases, well, there are 14 different sections for listings. And so those are the 14 different body systems. And that's simply how the government's classifying it, the same way the medical field is classifying it. I've given you links to both of those. You can find those online if you're doing them. The schedule for rating disabilities for the VA is within va.gov. And the Social Security disability listings, the medical listings, is at ssa.gov at these particular websites. So what I'm going to try to do for each body system is tell you what the system is generally about. And then we're going to cover a few fun facts along the way. I hope you learn a few terms. I hope you learn a few fun facts, and some of them are probably more fun than others. A few may be a little boring too, but the idea is let's remember a few things about, for instance, the cardiovascular system. Now, the cardiovascular system deals with the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. So it's not just your veins and your arteries, it's the stuff flowing through there. It's the stuff that makes them up. And of course, it's the big muscle, the heart. The average heart is the size of a fist in an adult. It beats about 115,000 times a day. It pumps about 2,000 gallons of blood every day. The first open heart surgery occurred in 1893. A doctor named Daniel Hale Williams, who happened to be one of the very few African-American cardiologists in the US at the time, performed it. And the first implantable pacemaker came about 60 years later. Arne Larson, who received it, actually lived longer than the doctor who put the pacemaker in his body. Some of you may not know what a pacemaker is. It's a small, very small device that actually sends out an electrical signal that makes your heart beat, oftentimes at a more regular rhythm. The most common day of the year for heart attacks, the medical term for that, which I didn't italicize for some reason, is myocardial infarction, just a heart attack. Christmas Day is the most common. And the reason heart cancer is pretty rare, you probably never heard of it, is because heart cells stop dividing. And cancer is actually a condition where cells divide out of control. The endocrine system. Now, this deals with hormones, the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal glands, pancreas, and the gonads. Now, your body makes 30 different hormones, and they are actually largely the same among all the mammals, most of the mammals in the animal kingdom. The endocrine glands are ductless. they actually secrete hormones directly into the blood system. There is a gland called the pineal gland. It's in your brain that has a shape similar to that of a pine cone, and it's responsible for creating melatonin. And some of you may know that as the hormone that makes you sleep. It's actually sold over the counter. You can buy it at health food stores, for instance. And what the pineal gland does is it receives a signal about whether it's light or dark outside. And of course, that comes through your eyes, down your optic nerve. When the light comes in, gets turned into electrical impulses, makes its way through your brain to the pineal gland. And your brain then knows if it's light or dark outside. And with the typical sleep schedule, people fall asleep at night. The thyroid gland is shaped similar to a butterfly, and it's located in the lower part of the neck. And it makes two hormones. And you may know somebody who's actually taking one of these because they're produced and prescribed now: thyroxine, T4, and triiodithyronine, which is T3. Most of the people that I know of that have had thyroid problems take T3. And those are necessary for all of the cells in your body to work normally. Iodized salt was actually developed because iodine is essential for the thyroid gland to function properly. And so people who don't have enough iodine in their system have problems with their thyroid. And the pancreas, which is an enormously important organ in the body, by the way, named after its fleshy appearance. The Greek root pan, which means all, and kria, which means flesh, were put together to create the word. The pancreas is important to diabetics because diabetics have a pancreas that doesn't work properly. It doesn't produce insulin properly. And insulin regulates the amount of glucose. So insulin is a hormone. And glucose, of course, is sugar, blood sugar. And in addition, it regulates glucagon, which actually promotes the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. Glycogen is derived from carbohydrates. It's our body storing that energy, and that has to get broken down. So the liver is tied into this also, but it all starts with the pancreas. And the idea is how much blood sugar is being retained, and then that's out of whack for diabetics. The gastrointestinal system, also called the digestive system. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about everything from the food in to the stuff out. So mouth, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Now, I mentioned the pancreas in our last section for the endocrine, but that's because of the hormones that are being produced that impact it. The pancreas is actually part of the gastro system. And the average person will actually produce 2 pints of saliva, which is the watery liquid in your mouth. You probably already know that word, but you may not know, and I'm sorry, I realize there's a typo in my slide. It's secreted by glands in the mouth and provides lubrication for chewing, and it also helps with swallowing and aids in digestion. But the fun fact is that's 32 ounces a day, 2 cans of soda a day. The muscles in your esophagus, so your esophagus is in your neck. It connects your throat to your stomach, I should say at the bottom of your neck going down. Those muscles act like a giant wave. That process of the giant wave pushing things down is called peristalsis. Peristalsis. We all make mistakes saying these words. It's perfectly okay. Just correct it and move on. So the small intestine is about 22 or 23 feet long, and the large intestine is only about 5 feet long. Now, the fun word of the day, the second part of your small intestine, it's called the jejunum, Jejunum, and it is between the duodenum and the ileum. Now, at the end of the day, do you need to know all of the parts of the small intestine? For most legal cases, you probably don't. But understanding where that is in the body and understanding it's part of the small intestine has value. Certainly in something like a medical malpractice case, that could be a very big deal if there's a cancerous issue or a surgical error or something like that that impacted these structures. And the final fact about the gastro system, did you know that a platypus does not have a stomach? I just found that interesting. The immune system, diseases and disorders of the immune system. It's a wide-ranging area. Anything that deals with fighting infection, fighting off infection. Fever generally means your immune system is working. So, of course, we have this tendency to take medication like aspirin to try to, or Motrin to try to reduce our fever. But very often, low-grade fever just means that the system is working properly. The immune system actually gets weaker as we age. And now in COVID times, we kind of see this. The older people in the population are impacted worse by things like COVID and flu because they don't have the ability to fight off infection the same way. And the reason is the tissues begin to shrink and our white blood cell count starts to decline. And the cells that make up the immune system are not centralized. So one of the things about the immune system is it's a body-wide system. So they're produced in organs throughout the body, everything from the tonsils to the lymph nodes, the spleen, inside your bones and the bone marrow, and your adenoids. The integumentary system. This is your skin, your hair, your nails, and the glands that are in your skin. The skin is actually the largest organ in the whole body. These systems equal 15% of the whole human body mass. And the average adult has approximately 21 square feet of skin, which weighs 9 pounds and contains more than 11 miles of blood vessels, 300 million skin cells. And you may already know this, the skin is thickest on your feet, but it's thinnest on your eyelids. You may never have thought about that before. And it renews itself every 28 days. That's the integumentary system. Now, the lymphatic system. This is the tonsils, the spleen, the thymus, the lymph nodes, the lymphatic vessels, your bone marrow, and lymph fluid. It's actually bigger than the vascular system and moves about twice as much fluid each day. It's unidirectional. It only pushes in one direction. So wherever you have blood vessels, you're also going to have lymphatic vessels, but they're separate systems. They're connected and they run in tandem. The system generally defends your body, and its job is to move foreign bodies out of the system, to detoxify, using a term that we commonly hear today. So B lymphocytes are in charge of making antibodies, and the antibodies actually attack the foreign cells and move them out. There isn't a pump, though. So the circulatory system, which has your heart to move blood through your body, not the same in the lymphatic system. It essentially works off of mechanical movement, gravity, and pressure to move fluid around. Lymph starts as plasma, and that's the watery component that makes up over half of our blood volume. A very common problem is something called lymphedema. And lymphedema involves the pooling of lymph fluid in the body. And you may have observed it in older people who have very large ankles or lower legs. It's not uncommon at all, particularly in older people. There are different types of cancers related to this too. The most common are Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And at the end, I probably should tell you, if recollection serves, there's 20 different kinds of lymphoma, but Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's are the most common. And so very often in the medico-legal world, cancer is not something that we run across as it's occurring, but we see downstream sequelae from it, particularly in the disability area. It can be an issue in the medical malpractice area because someone may develop cancer because of something that happens. I've mentioned cancer a couple of times. That's why I bring this up. So it's important to understand for each of these systems, and we're about halfway through the system so far, there are many different conditions that can impact a person in terms of that system. They don't exist by themselves, though. They can be comorbid with other problems. And comorbid just means medical conditions existing at the same time. So, for instance, we talked about cardiovascular disease, and there's many different types of cardiovascular disease. Arteriosclerosis, what's often called hardening of the arteries, where plaque builds up. A person could have a stroke. That's a cardiovascular condition. Also, a blockage of the blood vessels to the brain, a reduction of blood flow and oxygen to the brain. These can occur and exist contemporaneous with other problems. So while I'm talking about systems, it doesn't mean that these exist in a vacuum, so to speak. The inside of the body is supposed to be a vacuum, but that's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is by themselves. People, as you may know, can have many different problems at the same time. And in the medico-legal world, very often you're looking at all of the different problems that a person has. Sometimes you're doing that to segment out what problems were pre-existing and which are new. Sometimes, like in many disability cases, you're trying to evaluate the overall impact of all these different conditions occurring together. So I probably could go back a couple here and bring up a couple of other diseases that you may be familiar with or may have heard about. Aortic aneurysm, a bulge or a tear causes internal bleeding in the aorta. That's a significant problem, of course, and can lead to death immediately. We talked in the endocrine section about diabetes. That may be one of the most common conditions in our country and one of the most common things that lawyers have to deal with that impact a particular claim. For example, diabetes can impact whether a person heals well. It can also impact different appendages in the body through something called peripheral neuropathy. So a person who's in a car accident, for instance, may have an injury to their low back and they may have some symptoms in their low leg, but if they were a diabetic previously and they had peripheral neuropathy, they may have already had symptoms in their lower leg. So there's a pre-existing condition issue that's in play. For a veteran who develops diabetes that's service connected, let's say they were exposed to Agent Orange, they have a presumption that that diabetes is service connected. If downstream they develop peripheral neuropathy, that can actually be service connected on a secondary basis, and it should be rated separately by the VA and paid according to its severity. So understanding not only the systems, but the diseases that can happen with each system and what can flow downhill from those is important for you in doing different types of medico-legal work. Now, in the outline, in each of the sections, I have a list of diseases that are fairly common for each of these body systems. So I would commend the outline to you and suggest that you look at those and understand that these types of problems exist. So for instance, for gastrointestinal or digestive, things like irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's and colitis are extremely important. There's also GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, which can start as heartburn, can get worse. They have medication to try to stop it. But if it goes on long enough, GERD can ultimately cause what's called Barrett's esophagus, which can lead to esophageal cancer. So a lot of things in the body can be interconnected and flow downstream. A couple of other diseases briefly in the immune system. Lupus is something that you're going to hear about a lot. Also, well, in the VA world, you see a lot of veterans with allergic rhinitis. But more importantly, rheumatoid arthritis is considered an immune condition. It is an immune response. Skin, if you were a teenager ever, you might have had acne. Acne, of course, is a skin condition, but there's so many other types of skin conditions. Perhaps the most important as we get older are the different types of cancers. Basal cell carcinoma, it has to be treated. Squamous cell carcinoma, where instead of The basal cell is typically a discolored section. Squamous cell, there's a rough surface skin colored lesion that comes into play, and it is fatal. So anyone with squamous cell carcinoma needs to have that detected as soon as possible. Melanoma, of course, is also a significant cancer, and it's fatal about a third of the time. So those are extremely significant. There are reasons to go to a dermatologist, a doctor that treats the skin, and have a full body skin exam on a regular basis. So moving on with the systems, the muscular system, muscles and tendons. Those are the things that attach the muscles to the bones. And there are three types of muscles in the body. There's skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Now, skeletal is what you think of when you think about the muscles in your body. Smooth muscle are the muscles that are inside your blood vessels and your organs. Cardiac, of course, is your heart muscle. Now, only the skeletal muscles can be consciously controlled. So you, for instance, might be able to try to de-stress and reduce your heart rate by reducing your stress and controlling your breathing. But you cannot consciously control your heart, but you can consciously control whether you open or close your fist, for instance. Muscles make up about 40% of our total weight. The heart is the hardest working. It actually pumps 5 quarts of blood per minute, 2,000 a day, 2,000 gallons a day. The largest, if you may not know this, is the gluteus maximus. So the largest muscle is that muscle in your rear end, and it helps us maintain upright posture. That's the purpose of it. The ear has the smallest muscles in the body, and the strongest is the masseter muscle that's in your jaw, and it actually allows the teeth to close with a force of up to 55 pounds on your incisors and a couple 100 pounds on your molars. Now, there are many different types of muscular problems that exist. In car accident cases, muscle strains and sprains are extremely common, for example. But there's other things that are much more long-term and can be extremely significant in terms of function. For instance, polymyositis is an inflammation and progressive weakening of the skeletal muscles, and it can lead to a person becoming utterly incapacitated. Tendinitis is the inflammation of a tendon. It can be extremely painful when it's acute, when it's flared up, if you would. Carpal tunnel syndrome would be categorized as a muscular condition, and that is a mechanical malfunction in the wrist where the median nerve, a nerve that runs down the arm, becomes compressed between the carpal bones. They have a surgery to release that pressure, but it can be very painful and impact a person's ability to work because they can't use their hands. You've undoubtedly heard of muscular dystrophy, and that's a genetic condition, a congenital problem that deals with defective proteins in the muscle cells, and one gets progressive weakness of those cells. Myasthenia gravis is actually a significant condition. I've represented many people over the years with that condition. It's an autoimmune response in the muscular system, and it essentially deals with antibodies blocking the neuromuscular receptors, so the muscles don't receive the signals properly. Very often, a person who has it, and it actually impacts women much more than men, have some characteristic signs that stand out. Drooping eyelids is one of them, and it's as I said, women are primarily affected more than men, typically between the ages of 20 and 40. And a neuromuscular condition that many of you may know about is Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is extremely problematic. It's much more common than people think. Typically, it's characterized by 4 motor signs and symptoms where a person starts with a muscle tremor. Usually that tremor is in a hand, and it's when they're at rest. They're not actually moving their hand, and that can progress to muscle rigidity, slowness of movement, and they get instability in terms of their ability to maintain their posture, their gait. you may have seen some commercials for a drug that's trying to treat hallucinations in people with Parkinson's. That can be a problem too, but it tends to be more downstream. Our next system, the nervous system. And crossing over between these two is something like Parkinson's, also multiple sclerosis. Those are both what they characterize as movement disorders, not a system, but a classification of conditions that impact the musculature, often with a nervous component. And MS can function much in the same way as Parkinson's does, but it doesn't have the tremor, but it results in a lot of fatigue, gait problems. It also can impact how a person processes information in their mind, and it's still being understood. They really don't understand well why that happens, but there's several different types of multiple sclerosis. Nervous system is your brain, your spinal cord, your ganglia, your nerves, and your sensory organs. Now, the nerve cells are called neurons. Your body has billions of them, and they're made up of three parts: dendrites, axons, and myelins. And the dendrites receive the signals. The axons send the signals on to other neurons, and the myelin is like a sheath, an insulation, if you would, on a wire that helps transmit the nerve signals down along an axon. Multiple sclerosis is actually a condition where the axons begin to deteriorate, and a person is demonstrated to have a characteristic lesion on the brain or multiple lesions on the brain. That is a common thing that happens down road, and that's why they begin having these muscular problems or fatigue or other things. Now, there's four types of neurons: sensory, central nervous system, motor, and receptors. And they each have their different properties. You may need to understand this generally, but you probably will not, in a medico-legal concept, have to dig into the details of this. The fastest nerve signals are the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord at 268 miles an hour. The slowest are those that transmit signals through the skin at 1 mile an hour. The sympathetic nervous system distributes signals to the body to help it get ready for physical or mental activity, and the parasympathetic nervous system controls the resting functions, stimulating digestion, activating metabolism, relaxation. The enteric nervous system is a completely different part that actually regulates bowel movements. And as we get older, we lose neurons. So at around 20, this begins, and a tenth of our neurons are gone by the time we turn 75. That's why older people often can't feel things the same way. You've heard this a couple of times in this presentation already. As we age, many cells deteriorate. For instance, taste. There's a reason why older people salt their food more than younger people. It's because they can't taste the food as much. The cells have died. And the longest nerve in the body is the sciatic nerve. And if you have ever handled a case involving a low back condition that was a serious injury or had surgery involved, the sciatic nerve is likely involved because it goes all the way down to the toes on either side of the body. Now, nervous disorders are numerous. Epilepsy, in addition to Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. That is a condition by which the body literally shuts down piece by piece, organ by organ, to the point where a person can no longer function. Alzheimer's disease is a component of nervous disorders. So those are very significant. Sensory: eyes, ears, nose, skin receptors, and mouth. I should tell you all before we get into sensory, we're going to take about a 5-minute break once I conclude with the next system. I don't know that we'll get through all the systems before we take our break, but a 5-minute break in the middle of a 2-hour block is always nice. So we'll do that. Back to the sensory. Some fun facts. The cilia in the ear are very small hair-like structures that vibrate. They're actually part of how we hear. They actually push earwax out of your ear naturally. So earwax is not a problem. It's a natural condition of the ear. And we can hear sounds up to 20 kilohertz. Dogs actually can hear them up to 45 kilohertz. Porpoise, 150 kilohertz. And of those three sections that make up the human ear, the middle ear contains the smallest bones in the body. This is something you may have learned in grade school. They're referred to as the ossicles, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Very often in a hearing loss case, why something has occurred is significant, and how it happened can be an important factor. Ultimately, the level of hearing loss is likely the most important thing, but how it occurred can come into play sometimes. In terms of sight, people blink 15 times a minute on average, and everything would actually appear two-dimensional if you only had one eye. Human eyes are made up of over 2 million working parts. The sense of touch, that's something we develop very early, 8 weeks into gestation. And touch stimulates endorphins. There's another medical term for you, another type of hormone. Blood pressure and heart rate can both be reduced by touch. Now, sensory issues can be very various. There's a wide variety of medical conditions that impact things. For instance, with the eyes, blindness, that should be obvious. Many people suffer from some level of myopia, nearsightedness, cataracts, which is sort of a milky film that develops over the eyes. And that area is normally transparent, the cornea, but it actually clouds up, and ultimately cataracts can be removed. This happens to people later in life. People like diabetics develop cataracts earlier than other individuals. Glaucoma is also a eye condition where normal fluid pressure inside one or both eyes changes, becomes altered, and that pressure impacts the optic nerve, which is a bundle of nerves at the back of the eye that leads into the brain. So the eye receives light through the pupil, which is that dark spot in the middle, the black spot. With glaucoma, the pressure is actually pushing on the back of the eyeball. So the fluid inside the eye is at the improper pressure, and at the back of the eye, where that bundle of nerves comes together and collects the light and turns them into electrical signals, it's having pressure applied to it. And it can result in blindness. I mentioned people that have myasthenia gravis before, who have droopy eyelids. There's actually a condition separate from myasthenia gravis called ptosis, P-T-O-S-I-S. That's droopy eyelids. You've probably seen small children who are crossed-eyed. That's called strabismus, and that can happen with certain medical conditions as well. Let's see. We've been going an hour. Let's break for 5 minutes. We'll be back. I have 3 o'clock now. We'll be back at 3:05 and pick up there. Grab a cup of coffee, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes. All right, we're back on. So we talked about sensory organs before, a couple more fun facts. Did you know there's 5 basic tastes? Saltiness, sourness, sweetness, bitterness, and umami, which is savoriness. And that's a hard taste to describe, but it's derived from the taste of glutamates. So everybody smells things different. And another medical term here, olfactory, your olfactory receptors, you have 900,000 genetic variations of that. So what smells one way to you, that's why it smells differently to somebody else because of genetics. And good smells make you happier. Reproductive. Now, this is everything you could imagine would be related to the reproductive system. Ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus, vagina, testes, ducts, penis, urethra, prostate, everything. A couple of brief facts. A female can give birth to approximately 35 babies in a lifetime. Fallopian tubes are about 12 centimeters long and about as thick as a sewing needle. And the uterus is about 3 inches long, 2 inches wide, but it can expand up to 20 times during pregnancy as a fetus gestates. And a healthy male testis can produce up to 500 million sperm per day. Actually, that's with 2. So, of course, these types of things don't often come up in a medico-legal context in terms of understanding the insides of what's going on, but it's not uncommon for people to have fertility issues. And sometimes understanding why those are occurring can be significant and helpful. There are different types of cancers that come up, both cervical cancer, prostate cancer, both can metastasize and be fatal. Sorry, I'm going to go backwards. We did talk about sexually transmitted diseases at the outset, and the old term for them in some of the systems, the disability systems that we deal with, the downstream sequelae from those can be significant. And they, of course, have to be taken into account, but people are not willing to talk about them a great deal. So oftentimes when reading medical records, what you will see is a reference to something like herpes or HPV, human papillomavirus, something like that. So, and you need to pay attention for those. And of course, the question is, are they impacting a person in any way? And in the VA context, erectile dysfunction is a huge issue for the sheer number of male vets who are having secondary reaction or relation to medications that they're taking for a service-connected condition. It can also be a significant thing in relation to an injury. So the lower spinal cord innervates that part of the body, the groin area. And what a person is feeling can actually be a downstream issue in something like a car accident case. So that's always an issue. It has to be looked at. Respiratory. So here I've got what I think is the fun fact of the day. The respiratory section deals with the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. I'm going to skip right to the fun fact, which is highlighted in yellow. You've all read it already on the screen. If you took your lungs and you unfolded them and expanded them to their fullest size, it would actually cover an entire tennis court. So your lungs are comprised of an enormous number of small parts that branch out like a tree. The left lung tends to be somewhat smaller because the heart is positioned over it and it goes around it. But lungs are very light. They effectively can float on water, and it's primarily because of the air that's contained within the alveoli. And those are small sac-like structures lined with a layer of water where the lungs and the blood exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the process of, or during the process of breathing in and out. They're actually only one cell thick to allow that gas transfer to occur. And somewhere in the range of 300 to 500 million alveoli in the adult lungs. Most people can breathe 4 to 6 liters of air. Males tend to be larger, in part because of size, but we only breathe about half a liter with each breath. And a portion of that air never actually reaches the alveoli. It's called dead air because it's not actually used in gas exchange. And even if you exhale really hard, you tend to retain 1 to 1.2 liters of air in your lungs. The diaphragm is a curved, thin muscle sheet under the lungs, and it's used in breathing because it flattens as it contracts and helps you expand your lungs. You don't think about breathing. That's controlled by your medulla oblongata, a part of the brainstem. The epiglottis actually covers the trachea when we swallow food. So the idea is that it doesn't allow any of the food we're swallowing to get into the lungs. Of course, we've all had that moment when we swallowed a little something into the lungs and that causes us to choke. I talked about cilia in the ear. Well, there's cilia in the lungs, and they actually move mucus and trapped particles out of the airway. Things like smoking or asbestos can damage those, and they cause mucus to build up. So a person who has asbestosis, for instance, has a significant problem with the functioning of the cilia. And you lose water as you exhale. You actually lose about a half an ounce of water at rest. And when you're exercising, you can lose up to 2 ounces of water during an exercise period. I should cover a couple of conditions. I talked about COVID and influenza earlier, pneumonia, and perhaps most importantly, from a disability perspective, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is something we see all the time, COPD. And in that condition, a person simply has the inability to transfer oxygen at a worse and worse rate, so they have difficulty breathing. They can't catch their breath. Now, the skeletal system. This is the bones, the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, and the joints. We've talked about the bones and other structures in the ear some. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes are the smallest bones in the human body. Your thigh bone, the femur, is the biggest. And I mentioned a few bones already, and there's a couple more on the page. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see highlighted a URL for AHS School's slide presentation on the skeletal system. It's actually a pretty good slideshow to go through not just the major bones, but also some of the smaller structures that are at the end of each portion of bone. For instance, at the end of your femurs, there are condyles, and the condyles are sort of the bulbous ends of the bone that interact with cartilage and tendons and ligaments and articulate with the other structures. So with your femur, for instance, that ball joint at the top of the femur inserts into what's called the acetabulum. The acetabulum is the receiver for the ball joint of the top of the femur. Well, this presentation actually does a great job of helping you understand how these joints interact. In the context of a medico-legal world, very often these skeletal injuries, primarily injuries to the joints, and that includes your spine, because your spine is nothing but a series of bones stacked on top of each other with joints in between each. These are important to understand. Some bones in the body, not as important to understand, but a little more interesting. The hyoid bone in the lower jaw is called a floating bone because it's not actually part of any joint. It's one of the few. And the hyoid bone makes it extremely resistant to fractures. But autopsies show that when somebody gets strangled, very often that's an indicator of it when there's a fracture. Newborn babies have more bones. As we get older, they fuse together. We go from 300 to 206 bones in an adult. And you may not know it, but teeth are bones. They're part of the bone system, the skeletal system. And not to dispel a myth, but cracking your knuckles does not cause osteoarthritis. But it could cause inflammation in your tendons, but it does not cause osteoarthritis. That's just gas escaping the joints. Some of the diseases that impact the skeletal system: osteoporosis. So where a person loses calcium and the bone structures get thinner and it weakens them. Very often older people have fractured hips, as an example. Kyphosis, something that used to be called dowager's hump, is a condition where there's an excessive curvature of the thoracic spine. And somebody looks to be hunchbacked, if you would. Osteoarthritis is a breakdown of joint cartilage. It essentially erodes, and you've probably heard people talk in your life, older people in particular, somebody who may have had an injury or that just had degeneration over the years of having bone on bone knees, where the cartilage has just worn away, broken down enough where they no longer have that protective structure on the end of the condyle of something like their femur, that bulbous structure that attaches in the knee to the bones of the lower leg, the tibia and fibula, the tibia being your shin bone. And of course, the kneecap covers those. And joint degeneration is common. It occurs in everybody as you get older. Every one of you sitting there right now is undergoing some level of joint degeneration, and your body may not reflect it significantly. You may live to be a ripe old age and never have any significant problems from it, but invariably there's some level of degeneration that occurs. It's part of why people are shorter when they're older. The urinary system. Kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, the urethra. So you may know you've got 2 kidneys. Their purpose is to cleanse your body of toxins and transform that waste into urine. Each is about the size of your fist. You can live on one. If they can't operate properly, you can undergo something called dialysis that will do it for you. So they can hook up your urinary system to a machine that will actually filter it to allow you to continue to live a somewhat normal lifestyle. You just have to undergo dialysis. Ureters run from each kidney to the bladder where the urine is stored. And the length of a person's ureter basically depends on how long your torso is. The tubes are about 1/4 inch wide, and they have muscular walls, and the walls squeeze small amounts of urine down from the kidneys into the bladder every 10 to 15 seconds. And most people feel a need to urinate once they get about a cup of urine into their bladder. But the bladder can actually hold 2 cups of urine. And the urethra, that's the final part of the urinary tract, and it empties the urine outside the body. In a man, it's much longer than it is in a woman. And because of that shorter structure and its location, it is the reason why women tend to have urinary tract infections more than men, though men still can get them. Now, there's all manner of things that can go wrong with the urinary system. Kidney disease is one of the most common. Kidney transplants, of course, come downstream from that. I mentioned urinary tract infections. Something that can be very disabling, more from a functional perspective, is something called interstitial cystitis, where an individual has to urinate on an extremely frequent basis, sometimes 20 or more times per day. And of course, that takes a person away from working. So in a disability context, like the type of practice that I have, if you were handling a Social Security disability or SSI case or a VA case, that is a serious functional impairment. Something else that can impact how often people have to urinate in men, prostatitis. So an inflammation of the prostate, which can impact their ability to completely void the contents of their bladder. All right, now we're going to do something interesting, a little switching tracks here. I'm going to try to play you a video, and I hope Christy tells me if the audio isn't coming through well. There's many different ways to try to memorize the various terms. You know, we've already gone through probably 60 or 70 terms. You may not have noticed as we went, but we've covered several things. Understanding what these mean is one thing. Keeping it in your mind is a totally different thing. And you might think I can go look that up at Google anytime, but there are a lot of terms that you're going to deal with over and over that would be useful to memorize. So I'm going to play this video for you, and you've got the URL here. If you'll be able to see it again, but I'm going to put this up here on the screen, and it's about 4 minutes. I'm hopeful that it will give you one way you might be able to memorize. It's also a little break from what we've been doing so far. I know that was a bit dry, so let's do something that could be a little more interesting.
Are you frustrated and stressed about how to memorize medical terms? Well, I'm going to give you a simple, easy, step-by-step way to memorize any medical term. Check this out. Now, this is how you memorize medical terms. Instead of going crazy and just doing it over and over with rote memorization and flashcards and making yourself insane, try this. Whenever you have a word that you want to memorize, take the word that you want to memorize and turn it into a picture. Maybe break it down by syllables. And then take the definition and turn that into a picture, and then put those two pictures together. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take the word acapnia. It means having a lower level than normal of carbon dioxide in the blood. So we need to take the word acapnia and a lower level of carbon dioxide in the blood, turn them both into a picture and see it in one big picture. Acapnia, we'll turn that into a picture by seeing a baseball cap on your knee. Acapnia. Now, a lower level of carbon dioxide in the blood, we need to turn that into a picture. Well, people often think of carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere by coal or gasoline burning. So I want you to see coal or gasoline and it's burning. And on top of that, we put the baseball cap with the knee. See the knee getting hot from the flames. So now when you think of acapnia, I want you to also think of the coal or the gas burning around that. And that is the definition and the word tied together. An important thing, it's a low level of carbon dioxide. So I want you to imagine that picture low, like low down on the ground, to remind you low level of carbon dioxide. The next term is the macula of the retina. This is the light sensitive tissue on the back of the eye. So as we read, light is focused on our macula, and millions of cells change that light into nerve signals that tell our brain what we're seeing. So we have the word macula. We need to turn that into a picture. For me, I think of a Big Mac, a hamburger, a Big Mac, and it's eaten by Dracula. So you have a Big Mac eaten by Dracula. It's a macula. And the key word here is light goes into the macula and it goes out as nerve signals. So see light going into the macula and then going out as nerve signals. So we took the word macula and we turned it into a picture. Light going in and coming out as nerve signals. All right, one more medical term, octapressin. Octapressin is an ingredient that may be added to a local anesthetic to constrict the blood vessels. So we take the word octapressin and we turn it into a picture. We imagine an octopus and it's pressing. And what does it do? It constricts blood vessels. So imagine the octopus is pressing on blood vessels to constrict them. So we took three words here. We turned the word into a picture and the definition into a picture. So the first word, acapnia. Do you remember what that meant? Low levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. Macula. What did that do? Light going into the eye and out as nerve signals, sending it to the brain. And finally, we had octapressin. What was octapressin? It was an ingredient to put in local anesthetic to constrict the blood vessels. So how'd you do? It's pretty simple, right? Here's the basic concept. Turn the words you want to remember into a picture, the definition, and tie them together in a story. And that is how you remember any medical term. Now, if you want to make this easy for yourself and start memorizing medical terms faster than you ever thought possible.
Okay, I'll stop his ad there. But I will say he's got some good videos, and I would encourage you to take a look at Ron White's videos there. There's a link, and you can check him out on YouTube. I don't get paid to recommend him. I'm not getting paid anything. I just want you to remember these terms, and it's one way you might be able to do it. Here's another YouTube lesson on medical terminology. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's just a different way to go about this. And the guy has, as you can see, lesson 1 here. There's multiple things that you could look at. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube that will help you learn these things. So let's talk about directional terms next. We're going to take a little switch here. The directional references in the body are relational. So top, bottom, left, right. And one of the frustrating things for a lot of people is when they're reading medical charts, they gloss over these things. So if you read something about the anterior or ventral portion of the body, you got to know that's on the front. The posterior or dorsal is on the rear. The cranial is upper towards the cranium. The caudal is lower. And there are different ways you might remember this. One of the ways to remember caudal is a structure called the cauda equina. At the bottom of the spinal cord, it branches out looking something like, at least the people that envisioned this originally, a horse's tail. And if you've seen a horse's tail, you know it's a bunch of long hairs that kind of spread out. Well, the bottom of the spinal cord would do that if it was freed from the bones that surround it. So think cauda equina at the bottom of the spinal cord, and things to the bottom are caudal. That's on the left side of the picture you see here. Now on the right side of the picture, you will see the concept of proximal and distal. Proximal being nearer to the body, distal being further away. If you think distant, it will help you remember distal. Medial, midline, lateral, further away from the midline. So again, I mentioned before Wikipedia, a good source for a lot of these types of images. There are also planes of the body. So when you're reading an MRI, for instance, you have to understand what slice they're taking through the body. So the coronal or frontal plane is a vertical plane that runs from side to side. It basically divides the body between front and back. That's the blue plane on your screen. The median plane slices the body in half the other way, perpendicular to the coronal plane. So it goes through the body from front to back or back to front, doesn't matter, but it divides the two sides of the body into its right and left halves. And the sagittal plane is basically a parallel plane to the medial. Oftentimes in an MRI, you'll see sagittal views from the side. The axial plane or transverse plane is the green plane. That's basically what cuts the body in half as we might traditionally think about it, top to bottom. So it divides the upper and the lower. Now, this is an important concept. And I've said Wikipedia before, but I have to say, if you go read this Wikipedia page, it will help you a lot. If you commit it to memory, it will help you even more. But this concept of anatomical terms of location is crucial for you to understand. And I'm going to play another YouTube video for you.
Wait, before you scroll away, you need to hear this.
We get to listen to the ad
Republicans
first. My
across the
apologies.
country
I'll talk
are
over
moving-
it. Go right through it.
What's up? Your head is on top of your body, right? I mean, of course it is. It's on top of your neck and that's above everything else. But what about now? I'm Patrick Kelly, and today we're learning how to describe where things are on the body. We call these directional terms. And if you watched my last video about naming the regions of the body, you know what they're called, but now we have to talk about where they are and how to get to them. And to give accurate directions, anatomists need a consistent map to base them off of. That's why we use the anatomic position, a standardized position that we picture in our heads whenever we're using these directional terms. Here, stand up and do this with me. It's standing up straight, feet flat on the floor, looking forward, arms by your side, and palms facing forward. This will be forever and always your reference point for talking directional terms. Now, this body thing is three-dimensional, so we're gonna need some axes and planes to work with. And you can think of these like lines that slice people in half. Like imaginary, they're imaginary lines. First up is the transverse plane, which cuts people into a top half and a bottom half at the waist. And let me just blow your mind with some magic. It cuts people into a half that looks like a T and one that looks like an upside down V for transverse. The frontal plane just divides the body into a front half and a back half. Not nearly as mind-blowing, but it is easier to remember. Finally, the sagittal plane divides the body into a left half and a right half. It's the only way that you can divide a body into two identical halves. So I remember this one by the two identical T's in the name. And because the sagittal plane gives us two equal sides, it also gives us our midline, which helps us establish our first two directional terms. There's medial, which means we're going towards the midline, and lateral, which means we're going away from the midline or out to the side. If you've seen a lateral in football, it's really similar. It's when the ball gets passed sideways. It's the same thing in directional terminology. And since you have two equal sides of the body, things can be bilateral, which means that they're on both sides. Now, maybe you're thinking you're all high and mighty because you learned some directional terms. You might even think that you're superior to all others around you who are inferior. First off, wow, that's incredibly rude. How dare you talk about people like that? But also, those are our next two directional terms. How did you know? Superior means pointing towards your head, while inferior means pointing away from your head. Now, if I look down or inferiorly, do you see that? Ah, it's ants, which is exactly how you're going to remember the term anterior. We're referring to the front of the body. And on the flip side is the posterior, or the back half of the body. And excuse me, would you please stop staring? Gosh, you're so superficial. Luckily, superficial is the directional term for shallow, or towards the skin. And on the other side, you could be going deep, away from the skin. Now, the limbs get their own terms because they're all over the place. If you take your arm out and look at your fingers, they're so far away, they're so distant, which is exactly how you're going to remember that directional term. Anything away from that joint is going to be distal. But if you look at your shoulder, it's in way closer proximity, which is how you're going to remember that directional term, proximal. And you can say the same thing for your leg. Your hip is proximal to your knee, but your toes are distal to your shin. Speaking of your toes, that whole foot thing doesn't really have an easy shape. So we call the bottom of your foot the plantar side and the top part of your foot the dorsal side, which is the side that you tie your shoelaces on. And you'll probably tie those shoelaces with your hand, which have a palmar side and a dorsal side as well. Now that you know the basics, you get to have some fun with them. You can start using them to give directions all around the body, like, I can never reach my posterior thoracic. Can you scratch that for me? Or you can use a combination of directional terms. Yeah, that's good. Just like a little more superior laterally. And really, you never know exactly when you're going to use them, but you do know for sure that you are going to use these every day in your study of anatomy. And if you need a refresher on the regions of the body, now that you are directional terms pro, you can go ahead and check.
All right. I think one of the points I want you to understand about YouTube is there's probably a YouTube of someone doing something that you can remember. So you may have found him to be corny. You may have found him to be annoying. You may have found him to be spot on and love what he was bringing to you, but I'll bet you could find 10 other videos and one of them is going to help you remember something. So let's talk about some other terms. So these are important because these are going to pop up in medical charts all the time. The status or a current existence of a particular person or a condition. So acute is a sudden flare-up or potentially severe issue needing immediate care, but the duration is typically short. Now, just because it's not listed as acute in a chart, a particular condition, doesn't mean it's not serious. It just means at that moment, it's not flaring up. So we'd have to look at chronic. That's the third item on this list. Chronic demonstrates a recurring, persistent condition, usually lasting more than 3 months. Well, that would be more of a long-term problem, maybe a permanent injury. Understanding those two things by themselves can help drastically. Very often, decision makers who work for insurance companies or government agencies like to cherry pick information that reflects that something isn't acute, so it must not have been that bad. And they don't talk about the chronic nature of the problem. And very often, physicians may not document using the word chronic that a condition has been present for an extended period of time, but you can establish that by looking at the medical records. And in coordinating with a doctor, one could get the doctor to explain that the problem has been chronic, it's longstanding. Let me take a little sidestep for a moment. When you read medical charts, it's really important for you to understand that the medical chart doesn't exist to help you necessarily. It's really there for the doctor or the other healthcare practitioner and their staff to understand what it was that was treated in the past, what was going on at that time generally. They don't write down everything. They're not verbatim notes of an encounter with a patient. The doctor's putting down something that will help jog their memory, that will tell them what they did. It's a recording of medication that may have been prescribed, and that's why there may be some more detail about that. but they're not writing down every single thing the patient says. And so for that reason, sometimes you do actually need a doctor to sort of weave together their memory of the patient with the medical records to explain actually what they've treated and what they've observed over time. Some other conditions about status that you may see: benign means not cancerous or malignant. Malignant means that something contains cancerous cells. Critical is when vital signs are out of a normal range and somebody may be unconscious. Now, we're going to talk about some medical conditions that we see all the time. And the purpose of this is to tell you some things that we in the medico-legal context will kind of see come up periodically, if not frequently, and talk about some of the components of those. They may not be as laden with medical terms as some other component of this discussion was, but you can be familiar with them and you can know generally what they are and how to go research them. We'll do a bit of a deeper dive in terms of spinal injuries because we see those as much as anything else. So the spine is composed of different components. You can see the 5, if you count the coccyx, different sections. The coccyx being the bottom of the tailbone, the sacral spine right above it, the lumbar spine in the low back, the thoracic spine in the middle. Again, that's really where your rib cage is wrapping around your body, the cervical spine in the neck. You'll see this curve. This is a normal curvature or lordosis. There are discs between each of these bones. So every colored segment you see here is a bone called a vertebra or vertebral body. Each disc is essentially a shock absorber between those vertebrae. The discs have nerves that are flowing out of them. The purple at the top innervates the shoulders and the arms. The thoracic innervates the center portion of the body, the chest cavity, if you would, and the abdomen. The lumbar innervates the groin, the parts of the rear end, down the legs, and the sacral down the legs. Here's a little closer look at what's inside there. That yellow stripe down the middle is the spinal cord. This happens to be an image of the cervical spine. You can essentially see that they've gone through and literally cut half of the vertebral body away, and you're looking at one half of everything. The little thing squishing out in the middle that says herniated intervertebral disc is an example of a disc like the one above that's normal that has actually, either because of trauma or for some other reason, pushed out and into the spinal canal in this graphic. These little things to the right that are sticking out are the spinous processes. They're a portion of the bone, but that's a herniation. Now you'll see different stages of disc degeneration, and you'll read about these, and they do mean different things to different people. To some doctors, a bulge is a herniation or a herniation is a bulge, but generally speaking, this is what you're going to have to understand. A normal disc looks kind of like a shock absorber that's sitting there and it's even all around. A degenerated one is a bit collapsed. They can essentially get dehydrated. You will see the word desiccated. And you can think of a desiccant. A desiccant are those little things you get in a box that comes from Amazon that keeps the moisture out. So they're dried out. A bulging disc, you can see the third item down, has a little bit of a nodule sticking out. This is not necessarily because of trauma. It can simply occur as people age. It can occur and unbulge in an individual, either because of some posture they were in for a long period of time. That's not as common, but it can happen. Most people who are in their 50s and 60s have some level of bulging in their discs. You may read the phrase annular, A-N-N-U-L-A-R, bulge. That's when the edges of that disc are actually bulging around the top or the bottom of the disc over the vertebral body. You'll see the herniated disc has that red segment that's pushed out. And then a thinning disc, which would be a more advanced stage of degeneration, has collapsed. Christy, I do see that there's some chat items. Were there any questions that I should stop and answer at this point?
questions, just some clarifications about the link for the materials.
Okay, thank you. Now, I mentioned nerves that exit. So each of these vertebral bodies has essentially a hole in the side. So the way the bone is structured, it creates an opening where nerves can exit from the spinal cord and go to different parts of the body. We call that innervating the body structures. So this yellow item that's circled is the intervertebral foramen. That is the opening through which the spinal nerves exit. You'll see here it says for lateral exit. That means to the side. So if someone is looking at you from the front, you don't have nerves exiting to the front of your body. They actually exit off to the left and to the right. And you'll see in this image, the spinal cord is the thick tube running in the back of the vertebral bodies. Now, we'll go through the most common 3 types of surgical procedures that are done on the spine. This is an image of a discectomy. You can see it's spelled a couple of different ways. Typically, this is done with an endoscopy. It's done in a small incision. They do it on a micro level, and they go in and they snip off the chunk of the disc that's a problem. Now, what happens when a disc bulges too much or herniates? It actually pushes on structures. In this case, you see these yellow structures that are depicting the nerve, and you see this red section that's it's representing to be an inflamed segment of the nerve. Because that nerve is being impinged or pushed on, what's happening is the signals are not being transmitted properly to the portions of the body that nerve innervates. That means the person could be experiencing numbness, tingling, or pain, or they may lose feeling entirely. So physician would go in and they would essentially trim up the disc. They'd trim up the portions that were sticking out. This is not as significant a procedure in terms of the level of activity that's going on in the spine as a fusion. So a fusion is where a surgeon goes in and actually removes disc material and attaches the bones together so that they effectively operate together. The idea is the bones will grow together. You'll see here what appear to be screws. That's because those are screws. They go in with rods to attach the screws together. And this is effectively a 2-level fusion procedure where those 3 vertebral bodies and the 2 discs that were there are pulled out. Something else is put in between. Very often it's a piece of bone. It could be taken from someone's hip and inserted. And the idea is the body will make all that grow together, and then they will move more as one structure. A person does lose some flexibility, of course, when that happens. And it may or may not resolve the problems that were happening, but this is very often used when the discs are so herniated that there's a very thin level of disc material, they're obliterated, it's degenerated over time. So this is a post-surgery spinal fusion image. And also you will see a laminectomy. So there's a portion of that vertebral bone called the lamina, which is actually removed so that the spinal cord or a nerve root actually can be exposed better. So instead of going and trimming up a disc, they're actually going in and removing a portion of the bone. Sometimes this is done in conjunction with something called a foraminotomy. So I talked about that hole, if you would, that the nerves exit through. They may go in and actually open up that hole to be larger, essentially do a roto-rooter job on the foramen so that the hole gets bigger and is not impinging on nerve. This happens to be an image of a lumbar laminectomy, which is typically where you'll see a laminectomy done. Now we talked about innervation. This graphic shows all of the nerves running through different parts of the body. I have a couple of other graphics that will show this also, but you can see nerves from the top of the body running down the arms, nerves from the lower portion of the spine in blue running down the lower parts of the body. Some of those nerves only go down to the knee. Some go further down all the way to the feet. There are branches that branch out. So understanding how these distribute can be very helpful. So if you're interacting with an individual who's telling you they're having numbness in a certain part of their body, or they're having pain that goes down over their buttock, down the back of their leg, but stops at the back of their knee, you may be able to find that it's a classic pattern for a given nerve root. And that is something you might be looking for in the medical records. This graphic also gives you names of the different major nerves. So for instance, here in the arm, you'll see musculocutaneous nerves, the radial, median, and ulnar nerves coming down. From the sacral plexus, here, the sciatic, the tibial, the common perineal, the deep perineal, the superficial perineal, and the sural nerves. Now, this graphic I offered for two reasons. First, at the bottom, you'll see I've highlighted Facebook. This actually came off of a Facebook page, and I've given image credits to these folks. So for here in our educational purposes, what you should understand is first, you can find images all over the web for these types of things. This particular image is often called the quadrupedal nerve distribution, and it shows a person essentially on all fours where the different segments of the body would go impact the different, the different segments of the nerves coming off the spine impact the different segments of the body. So again, you can find images anywhere, and I encourage you to do so. Now, this is a better image of that, and it gives you a little better idea. So you can see, look at the person's posterior end, that the sacral nerves from S4, S5 actually impact different segments of the backside. If you go down their leg, you'll see the nerve coming off the S1 root actually impacts a different portion of the leg than that for the S2, the L5. So the L5 being the lowest lumbar level and the S1 being the highest sacral level, and the nerves coming out between them. So a point to make about this is that you check more than one source to get an idea of what you've got going. Now, the spinal nerves also control the organs. So this graphic here would show you all of the different organs. And we don't have enough time to cover all that in a 2-hour presentation, but it gives you an idea. For instance, if you look to the bottom and look at the pelvic nerve coming off the sacrum in the bottom of the lumbar spine, you can see somebody with a disc injury that was bad enough could impact their ability to defecate, urinate. It could impact their kidney function or their sex organs. And that's extremely common. So pay attention to this when a person has a spinal problem. And neuropathy, there's many different types of nerve problems that can develop about the body. Some of them are disease related, like diabetic neuropathy, where the cells just break down over time and a person literally loses their ability to feel their feet or their hands. But there's other types of neuropathies, and they're all characterized by pain, numbness, tingling, and weakness in the extremities. And for a detailed slide presentation, check this out on the left side here. So people often have difficulty using their arms, their hands, standing, particularly for extended periods of time. They have problems with balance issues. Migraines and headaches are another commonly seen medical condition, and there's different types of those. Sinus headaches, which of course relate to sinus pressure, cluster headaches, primarily around the eyes, tension headaches, which often are tied to an injury in the cervical spine too, where a person feels like they're having a band squeezing their head, and then migraine, where they get different types of symptoms, including auras, and they need to get themselves into a dark room to try to reduce the symptoms. Pain, nausea, vomiting, very common. Inability to focus and concentrate, and that's common with a lot of pain disorders. So you will oftentimes see references to that. And there aren't necessarily medical terms that doctors are going to use to describe those. Same with poor decision-making while in pain, difficulties with vision. Arthritis. You may not have known, but there's more than 100 types of arthritis. We could do 2 hours on arthritis. Osteoarthritis and rheumatoid are the most common that you're going to see. Spondyloarthropathies are not uncommon. Lupus is classified as an arthritis. Gout, still actually fairly common, is a type of arthritis where uric acid builds up in the system. Psoriatic arthritis, you may have seen commercials with the golfer Phil Mickelson. It can be extremely painful, and it's tied to psoriasis. So a person will have plaques that appear on their skin. So different types of immune responses and other conditions here in the arthritis category, but they all impact joints and involve swelling related to the bone and the connective tissues. Symptoms: pain, stiffness, swelling, redness, decreased range of motion. And they can have different types of limitations all around with exertional and non-exertional problems. Those are more vocational terms than they are medical terms, but they relate to physical movement versus non-physical movement, and they all can impact a person's functionality. Diabetes, we've talked about that a couple of times. That's a condition where the blood sugar is too high, typically because of an improper production of insulin. And there's two different types. Type 1 is juvenile. Type 2 is adult onset. And diabetes has a lot of downstream sequelae or downstream problems that flow from it. Eye disease, foot ulcers, kidney problems, peripheral artery disease, and neuropathy. Normal blood glucose, 80 to 100. Hypoglycemia, too low. Hyper, too high. And I've got a slide here on mental. I do want to tell you that this is a huge category by itself. Very common. We see PTSD, depression, anxiety. I would encourage you to look at the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 6th edition, and it will give you the current diagnostic criteria for the different mental health conditions. Sleep disorders include sleep apnea, a condition where a person's airway literally stops working. They choke in their sleep, effectively not breathing. Sleep disorders can be secondary to medication. Other conditions like narcolepsy and cataplexy, where a person almost instantaneously falls asleep uncontrollably, they can all impact a person's functionality during the day. And when you read about them, you have to understand that they're very often going to cause other downstream problems because the person is not getting restorative sleep. So restorative sleep, 7 or 8 hours a night, that allows a person to completely regenerate. And if they don't get that, they can suffer mentally in particular. Parkinson's disease, I mentioned that earlier, a nervous disorder that is a movement disorder, and it can impact motor skills. These are some of the different motor skills: bradykinesia, which is a mask-like face, decreased blinking; dystonia, where a person has repetitive muscle movements; rigidity, tremor; and then there's other issues. Multiple sclerosis, similar. The vast majority of people have something called relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, where it gets better for a while, then they have flare-ups, and it gets better for a while, and they have flare-ups. This is a movement disorder that is often characterized more by fatigue and concentration problems, as well as gait and other motor issues. So multiple sclerosis, these are the different symptoms. You can refer back to that another time. Fibromyalgia is a difficult condition to identify. It's typically a diagnosis of exclusion. It's characterized by these symptoms that you see on the screen here. Everything from fatigue to pain in certain locations, more achiness in those locations, but it can result in restless leg syndrome, urinary problems, vision problems, other things. Oh, I should tell you also, fibromyalgia should be diagnosed by our rheumatologist, and I'll talk in a moment about medical specialties. MS and fibro can have similar symptoms, and you need to be aware that sometimes people who are getting treated for both of these will go through a bank of medical testing and different doctors to get an idea of what's going on with them. Multiple sclerosis often is not diagnosed definitively until an MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging, where a person goes into the tube-like device that has the magnets that takes pictures of the inside of their body, documents a lesion inside their brain. Some prescription and treatment terms here. BDS, 2 times a day. The Latin mane for morning. We also have nocte for night. These are documentation that you might see in a chart about when something's to be administered. And then all of the prescription acronyms that come from the Latin that talk about how often something should be taken. PRN for take as needed. PR for per rectum. You probably understand what that is. Per orium, by mouth or orally, and so on. And you can refer back to these. Now, I mentioned specialties. So one of the things you need to understand is the different types of medical specialties. And the last several pages of the written outline lists not only medical specialties, but also the abbreviations for different types of providers, much longer than the list on your screen. And it would be interminably boring for me just to go through those for you. So that's why I saved it here to the end of the presentation. Here on the screen, you see MD for medical doctor. That's what most of us think as a doctor, a physician. DO is also a physician, a doctor of osteopathy. They're typically trained not only in the things that MDs are trained in, but also manipulation, like a DC, a doctor of chiropractic. Doctor of chiropractic doesn't prescribe medication like an MD or a DO. A PA is a physician assistant. A PAC is a certified physician assistant. NP, nurse practitioner. So they may be able to prescribe medication, but none of them except the DC or the DO would do manipulation, where they actually crack somebody's back or manipulate another joint. A PhD psychologist, most commonly is what you're going to see, might be a person to diagnose a mental health condition using testing. Unlike an MD psychiatrist or a DO psychiatrist who might prescribe medication, the PhD cannot. So you have to understand the type of medical provider that's treating your client. You may see in a chart that they're treating with a clinical social worker, LCSW, as licensed clinical social worker. That person's not going to carry the weight that a PhD would, or perhaps an MD would. So you have to be aware of that. And then you see these board certification terms like FAAD. And you look at that and you think, well, why do I really need to know what that means? Well, that happens to stand for Fellow of the American Academy of Dermatology. And if your client's had a back surgery and that was the doctor that was used to review the chart to make a decision about your client and whether something might be covered or it's disabling or whatever the case is, they're not qualified. So I have a list of those credentials as well, or you can go to this website that tells you more about board certification. All the different board certifications are listed there. So your takeaway here is that the terms that are being used to describe a medical condition are the key to understanding that person's conditions and the symptoms. You can't determine that the symptoms flow from the condition if you don't even know what the condition is or where it's happening in the body. And so without knowing the part of the body that's being affected or the condition that's involved, you can't assess the case. You can't understand what's going on in their legal case. And to determine if the symptoms are reasonably resulting from a particular condition, you have to understand that condition. And I'll close with a final example. I had the chance once to represent a really nice gentleman who had a lumbar surgery. He had a lumbar laminectomy and he had some residual symptoms down his leg. So when they went in and cut away part of the lamina, and he actually had a foraminotomy also, they didn't free up the nerve enough and he still had pain and tingling down his leg. I went to take the deposition of the adjuster. Now, this was a disability insurance case. And the adjuster, very pleasant young man, probably about 30 years old. And I said to him, "You're the person who made the decision on my client's claim, right?" "Yes." "You had a doctor look at the file. Did the doctor make the decision on the claim?" "No." "Did you consult with a supervisor?" "No." "So you were totally the person who made the decision that my client was not disabled?" "That's correct." Okay, well, let's talk about what's wrong with my client. Did you know that my client had a lumbar herniated disc? Yes. Okay. Where is that in the body? And he sat a minute or so and he said, I'm really not sure. I said, well, generally speaking, he says, well, it's in the spine. I said, okay, what part of the spine? Towards the head or towards the rear end? He says, I think it's in the neck. And he had a lumbar laminectomy. What's that? I think it's a surgery. Okay. Do you know what they do in a lumbar laminectomy? No. So the adjuster admitted to me that he didn't know the part of the body. He thought the part of the body was the exact opposite end of the spine from where my client actually had a problem and symptoms, and he had no idea what the procedure was. We won that case. And that's because he didn't know what he was talking about. But I did. And at the end of the day, if you want to win a case for your client and you want to help them achieve whatever their legal objective is in a medico-legal context, you have to understand these terms. I know it's a quick ride through medical terminology in 2 hours. If you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. But I wish you the best in your journey in this wonderful, fantastic practice of law. And I hope you find all the medical terms interesting and fun. Thanks.
Much. This was fascinating. You are an actual teacher. It's a good thing my video wasn't on the whole time because you would have seen me cringing, especially at your fun facts, like a woman can have 35 babies in her lifetime, and the fact that my joints are degenerating as we speak. But other than that, it was fantastic. So I really appreciate you doing this for us. I did want to announce that the CLE has been approved for 2 CLEs, and the number is 2104. 335 N as in Nancy. I put that in the chat, and I will also send it out tomorrow along with the recording and the materials. So I really appreciate both the presentation and the comprehensive materials. I'm always afraid to ask a busy trial attorney like you to do something like this, but you just jumped right in, and I really appreciate you doing this. Got lots of compliments in the chat, so hopefully you can see those. Everyone really enjoyed the program, and we did have one question come in. I think you kind of answered it with your last example. Do these surgeries solve the conditions all around, or will these conditions need constant medical attention even after treatment?
Well, that of course depends on the type of condition, but take low back pain. It's very common that somebody who doesn't have symptoms that shoot into their legs, they'll be stuck with low back pain, and the surgery is never going to change that. What surgeries typically on the spine can resolve are those symptoms that actually move out along the distribution of the nerves. So for instance, if a person has a cervical herniated disc and they've got pain shooting into their arm, they may be able to reduce or eliminate that pain in the arm, but they may not be able to eliminate what's going on actually in the neck, and they may have pain or achiness for all of time. Similarly, if somebody has a knee surgery, they may resolve symptoms with meniscectomy, where they take out the meniscus, or maybe they had a ligament repair, but the knee might be weaker, the structure might be weaker. So depending on the particular surgery, they may be able to resolve the pain or other symptoms that a person's having, but not every condition can be remedied by surgery. I hope that answers the question.
It's very individualized, of course, and I can barely tell you didn't actually go to medical school. You just have a knack for teaching about this stuff. So I really appreciate this. Again, I don't see any other questions, so I will let everyone go. But thank you so much, Mr. Tucker.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Take care. Bye-bye.